Beyond the last stop, Arthur liked that last run for the quiet. Even on bad nights with drunks or kids trying to ride for free, there was a slowness that came after the last proper stop, when the map thinned and the route bled into the outer roads where the warehouses sat with their windows blind. The city's wet light smeared itself along the windshield, a thin butter of neon laid down by the wipers and scraped back up with each pass. The bus talked to him in the ways he trusted. A belt chirp under load, a breathy sigh as the compressor cut out, the soft rush when the doors sealed. He knew those noises and no one could take them from him. He wore the same faded jacket every night, the one with the reflective piping cracked like dry riverbeds. He kept a piece of peppermint in the breast pocket for when his mouth felt like a coin. His thermos was dinged and smelled faintly of bleach because he rinsed it wrong years back and never quite got the ghost of it out. Dispatch had moved the late runs earlier that month, shaving minutes off at the tail ends, which left Arthur pushing a bus that did not want to be pushed through lights, that preferred to be admired instead of obeyed. He kept it legal. He kept it tidy. He minded the corners of the job because that was how a man got through. The depot at the start of the night had its own weather. Diesel breath and wet concrete, fluorescent hum vibrating through scaffolding of old gossip. Drivers stood with their paper cups, a ring of steam around each face, saying the same things without complaint. The route sheets rolled off the printer with their little warm ink smell. Arthur tore his and folded it in half and stuck it into the clip behind the wheel. He ran his hand along the dash as he did out of habit, his fingers catching dust and the grit of a season's worth of salt, and checked the little red lights by touch. On that shift, the rain had been steady since dusk. It came thin at first, then wiser, then thin again, like someone figuring a song on a guitar with 3 strings. It made the sidewalks shine in the way that erased all complicated judgments and left a city with only 2 kinds of surface, slick and not slick. He pulled out of the yard with the kind of care he'd learned. After the first winter, he thought he could muscle a bus into being smart. He pressed the brake at the first light and listened to the hiss run down his spine like an animal trying to find a way out. Passengers at that hour came in 2 species. There were the ones the city had stooped to scoop up and who rode the bus like an alibi. And there were the ones who worked late because someone had to, and because rent sits like a hand on a shoulder. Arthur would glance at their faces in the mirror and see the same act in both types, a polite refusal to add to anyone's story. He picked up a handful at the hub, a man with a package bound in twine, a nurse in damp scrubs with the particular look of someone who had been thanked too many times without hearing it, 2 teenagers who formed an alliance of silence around a plastic bag. The fare box took their offerings in spite of itself, the little magnet under the slot clacking a hair wrong, and Arthur gave it a gentle tap with his knuckle to shame it into behavior. The cash box swallowed the bills and made that papery wheeze he loved. The validator coughed approval in green. People sat in their spots. The bus had a map inside itself for where people preferred to be, and it tried to keep them where they were going in the least damaging way. Out along the boulevard, the lights blinked in an unsteady sequence that could have been random, or could have been a boy somewhere with a switch and a grudge. The route had been redrawn so many times that Arthur's hand took the wheel before his mind caught up. He felt the little pull under the chassis when the drain grates sucked at the tires. He watched the sidewalk gutters carry leaves along like fish that had learned a new river. He kept the heater low. Heat makes the windows sweat, and sweat turns into fog, and fog into ghosts on glass. At the factory stop, a cluster of men in jackets with a logo he had always loved for its confidence boarded with the weary choreography of people whose muscles still remembered a kind of respect from decades ago. They doled out their coins, metal clanking like a story about metal. One of them said thanks in the way that meant this is what we have left to offer, and it is not nothing. The route took its usual angle away from the center and tilted down toward the industrial fringe. There were places where the city had tried to keep its polishing up. A planter here, a bench there, a kiosk that didn't quite belong to the businesses it advertised. There were places where the city had let go, and those were the places Arthur trusted the most, because they were at least honest about the weather and the days. He knew the exact post where a traffic camera had given up and hung its head, the corner where a loading dock light had burned for a year, beyond its intention, and never again. He knew where the road sloped wrong and pooled water across a lane UD swear ran higher than its neighbor. The bus knew too. Its frame told him through the wheel, through the seat, through the tiny cough it gave when the front tires climbed a seam between old asphalt and new. He worried about one thing that night, the route, S24th stop out by the city line where the shelters were older than his jacket and the glass was cloudy with years. Every time he'd passed it, the shelter had looked like a child wearing his father's coat, too big for its purpose, too earnest to laugh at. No one ever waited there. The schedule put him past that stop at a time the city would prefer to forget. Past the last good diner, past the recycling yard with its mountainous shine, past a stretch of chain-link fence with warnings that had faded to pale ghosts of letters, the bus hummed and rattled and did not judge him. He breathed with it. He sipped his coffee at a light and burned his tongue in the way that told him he was alive. He put the lid back on and felt the seat under him protest his shifting like a live thing might. At the last of the regular stops, the nurse thanked him and stepped down into the rain with a small forward lean. The teenagers rang the cord and got off together without a glance back. The man with the twine package held it with two hands like a loaf and nodded twice as if to himself as he disappeared into the damp. Arthur closed the doors and felt the bus exhale, a soft letting go through felt lips. He approached the forgotten shelter with the usual readiness to pass. The shelter sat in a patch of darkness that felt like a polite invitation to criminals and to small truths. The plexiglass panels were fogged with old handprints and the bench held the glimmer of wet. Behind it lay an old lot with a chain thrown through two posts and a sign half peeled away. The streetlight that should have stood guard had a head full of wind and nothing else. Arthur would have let it go by, would have rolled gentle past and let the route fall quiet, but a feeling crawled up from the floor through the soles of his boots and fixed his foot to the brake. He could not have named it. He would not have called it fear then. He would have called it an instruction he hadn't known he'd be receiving, delivered through the bones of a vehicle he had considered his partner. He slowed. He turned on the hazard lights so that something in the night would admit his presence. He came to the line painted on the asphalt, a faithful little bar no one had asked to stand its ground. The shelter appeared empty. The rain changed from a sheet to a string of beads and back. He found the intercom button with his index finger, the way a man finds a familiar notch in a tool. He pressed the door switch. The doors opened with a sigh, water hiss that reached his neck like a whisper into a hood. Nothing happened the way a human mind likes to plot it. There was no figure, no shuffle of shoes. There was not even a special cold. There was only the smell of damp earth, a faint iron thread, and the sudden feeling that the front end of the bus had dipped a hair into a tide. The steps counted weight. The doors pressed against something because the safety strip pulsed and the doors hiccuped and tried again and then decided they would accept what presented. The floor under the fare box picked up a pressure that did not push to the left or right, did not fall away down the aisle, did not even entail a footfall in the old vocabulary of floors. It announced presence without aping bodies. Arthur kept his hands on the wheel. They knew where to be better than he did. The mirror showed him an honest nothing. Seats in their rows, grey fabric patterned with the nonsense shapes some laughing designer used to call decoration, poles that looked insufficient to their task and always proved barely equal to it. The aisle lay down the center of things, a humble river. If anything breathed back there, it was within the quiet and within the rain. He closed the doors because it felt wrong to leave them open once someone had bothered to use them. The bus changed again, the way a room changes when a person you love enters it without touching anything. The temperature not shifting so much as the meaning of the air. He eased off the brake. The bus moved without needing to be told. He would have told it otherwise. He would have wanted to, and he discovered he could not. A soft sound came from the back, a collection of breaths drawn at the same time and let out in a rag against a throat. They were small, patient breaths, the kind people make when they have surrendered the right to do anything but hold a place on a long ride. He looked to the mirror again, and he saw only the empty civic geometry of a bus at night. He touched the horn lightly and heard its flat answer wobble on wet air. He made the next turn with no conscious decision beyond the need to make it. The bus wanted the broader road, not the stop at the trailer park with its porch lights like teeth. Not the dogleg by the rink, where the asphalt was patched so badly the steering wheel tossed an insult. Not the loop around the strip of closed stores that wore their sale banners like a history lesson. The bus straightened its own spine and went out toward the highway like a swimmer choosing a lane. Arthur lifted the mic off its hook. He wanted to speak, to dispatch the way a child wants to speak to a parent, from a mouthful of paste. The radio made a dry sound as if opening its throat at a funeral. He put the mic back before the first word formed. He watched the speedometer creep and then settle where he would never have allowed it if he had been in charge. He did not panic. Panic wastes breath. Panic draws attention you cannot use. He let the bus have the first say. The wipers kept the glass workable in a measured rhythm that matched nothing else in the vehicle. The heater fan filled the left half of his head with a loco buzz. The lights on the dash kept their positions like stars in a cheap planetarium. The turn signal clicked not because he asked it to, but because the bus signaled its intention to itself. The last of the stops slid away, posts and panels and tiny city nameplates receding. The route ticker above the aisle was no help. It flickered the next neighborhood, then all blank blocks, then simply the name of the line as if to say, "You are on me and that shall be enough." The passengers breathed their small collective breath. He could not count them. He did not want to. He had never liked head counts except when he checked the emergency kit for flares. Rain laid a long, narrow river down the center of each lane. The tires sent up a whisper that made the cabin feel brushed. Arthur felt the steering wheel vibrate with the road's tiny claims. Here and there, the bus crossed a seam in the blacktop, and the wheel nudged as if to say, "Remember me, remember the time this cracked, and you almost learned to pray." He knew the shape of the road even where the lights failed. He could have driven that stretch with his eyes closed and would have been fired for it. To the left, the city dwindled itself into fields of parking lot where trailers slept with their latches facing inward like shy horses. To the right, the land ran low toward a drainage basin that held its water like a secret and then gave up when asked directly. Farther out, the ground rose to a levee, built sturdy in years no one wanted to admit had been better for building. Arthur found himself thinking of small things from other nights. The coffee in the staff room. He never learned to drink without scalding his tongue. The way the roll of transfers rested in the plastic caddy like a spool of twine in a kitchen drawer. The faint lemon smell of the wet mop on the tile at the end of a shift. He found himself thinking of the chipped mug his ex-wife used to keep too near the edge of the counter. How he had asked her carefully 100 times to slide it back 2 inches, and she had smiled and not done it. And he had learned to cup his hand there in passing until the night he did not, and it fell. And that was not why she left, but he let the memory stand. He tried the horn again. It gave the same tired baritone, not outraged, not even interested. He pressed the pedal to test what the bus would allow. There was nothing to hit but rain, and the bus answered in kind. Not accelerating in the traitorous way of a machine that had decided to override a man, but holding firm, as if to say, "We are not arguing, we are proceeding." he would have found that sentence insulting on another day. Tonight it felt like the only true way to describe motion. The road beyond the city limits wanted a simple obedience. Stay between lines, give distance, do not improvise. The bus obeyed in its way. It bypassed stops he had memorized with his knuckles long ago. An orange bench, half sunk in a ditch. A signpost bent like a nail pulled wrong and hammered back anyway. A car wash with its old neon heart wrapped in black plastic. The shelter where once the factory shift had waited until the factory had gone, like a part pulled from a motor and never replaced, slid by the window with an attitude he would have called sorrow, if such things could be given to structures. The bus leaned as it took a slight curve. Something in the back breathed out as if relieved to have gotten through a narrow place. He understood the sound without approving it. His skin told him the bus grew heavier seat by seat as they went. Not a weight he could quantify, not a weight a scale could shame or explain. Just a slow settling into the suspension, a change in how the shocks caught the small road pimples, a lowered pitch in the squeak of the handrails when he braked at a red that turned green for no one. He watched the clock in the dash and did not admit it to himself even as he did it. He breathed a little easier when he saw nothing there he didn't expect, just the unkind digits marching, reminding, not saving. He slipped the habit off like a wet coat and returned to his real instruments, the feel in the fingers, the high whine when the door seals leaked at the corner because someone had scuffed it with a boot last week and he had meant to mention it and had not found the day for it. The rain thinned. The highway rose to meet him where his route usually turned back. This time, it did not. It offered him a lane with a stripe so fresh it looked like a man-esque part after a barber-esque good work, and the bus slid into that lane like someone given directions in a language he had heard in childhood and had always wanted to practice again. His hands did not fight it. He watched the white stripe unfold under the windshield lip and felt born and felt old. Up ahead, the old bypass arced over the river flats. The viaduct had been closed for repairs long promised and rarely attempted. It wore barricades like a carnival crown that had seen a funeral. A sign warned of closure in plain block letters mounted on a frame that had not been painted in a decade and did not need it. The barricades blinked with their own weathered lights, the hum of the little units a prayer for attention. The bus slowed to consider them. It did not stop. It angled between two horses where a gap had been left by someone who liked to leave gaps and claimed it meant nothing about his character. Arthur said 3 words inside his head. "Don't do this," and the bus did it gently anyway. The ramp accepted them. The tires made a new sound he had never heard on those slabs. A papery shush, as if all the rain had been squeegeed into some other century and left to figure itself out. He felt the height under him and could not see it through the rain, and that was good. He could pretend it was a normal bridge. He could pretend gravity was still a neighbor who would lend him a tool. The viaduct deck was stripped in places for resurfacing. The bus found the clean lanes and stayed true. The joints between spans gave that hollow thump that can stir a man is lunch if he has not meant to stir it. Down in the flats, the river twisted under the black, and the lights on the bank made soft suggestions. The world from up here was as simple as the bus could have wanted. Forward, forward, forward. The back of the bus filled with the patience of those breaths, each a little pressure on the unseen, each taken with the calm of people who have given their time to a common errand. Arthur thought about the first time he'd driven a route late enough to find the city empty of outward signs. He had been young in a way the bus would never be again. The radio then had been the chain between him and something like order. He had loved the chatter, the careful way drivers did not say what they knew, the way dispatch allowed them the fiction of a direction. He had kept that love in the pocket with the peppermint. He still had it there now. He felt for it. The wrapper crinkled. He did not put it in his mouth. He did not want to share the taste with whatever rode behind him. They came off the other end of the viaduct without any event, besides the small swaying that told him he had not been in charge and had not died for it. The highway continued into a district of warehouses that had never stopped working, even when the newspapers had wished for them to retire with dignity. Here, the lights were hard and clean, the asphalt honest, the curbs deeply scarred by cargo. A forklift beeped at a distance, and the sound came to them late and lost some of itself along the way. The bus steered away from all the places where it might have put this event into the language of the job. No near police precinct, no all-night clinic with a metal sign that could forgive a man for wanting to see a person in a white coat. It took a parallel road lined with chain-link fence and thorn bushes, pressing their suggestion through. It eased past a yard where city trucks slept in rows, their beds tilted as if listening. It passed an old gatehouse with the glass knocked out and the chair inside overturned just so. The smell of the bus changed by degrees. The damp of the passengers' coats, which did not exist, became the damp of a field after a long rain. Then the damp of basement concrete after a summer of sweating. Then something else without a name. He thought of the smell that used to come off his father's work shirts when he hugged him at the end of a day. Metal grease, a sweetness underneath, and then something he has since called breath. That last was here, not his father's, not any person's. A gathered, stored air from a place that had not been opened polite. He found himself breathing shallow, not to protect himself, not to deny them, only to leave room. A red light found them and tried to make a point. The bus slowed, considered, and rolled the line like an old man stepping past a fence in his own yard. The cross street had nobody for the light to save. The rain eased into mist. The wipers clicked off and made a small sound like a weary bird settling its wings. He liked that he could see more clearly and did not like what the clarity revealed, which was simply that there was nothing special in front of him to explain what he already knew. Dispatch called then. The radio woke with a burst of static that sounded like frying on a hungry day. The voice was the night one, a woman he respected because she never talked down to him and never up to anyone who deserved it. She said his number, she said his line. She asked how he was progressing toward the end of route. She placed a neat pause where he could confess whatever he felt the need to. He picked the mic up and held it near his mouth, and then he said, in a voice he hardly recognized as his, just past the viaduct, a little reroute, observing some conditions will advise. He hung the mic back up and knew it was not enough, and also that saying the rest would be the same as saying nothing, because what use is a report the night cannot hold? He saw the bus barn then. Not his, a private yard for the old coaches that had been retired and cannibalized for what they had left, stacked deep and high and dripping with paint and memory. The chain link sagged there in an undignified sigh. A man with an umbrella in some other life would have called it picturesque. Arthur saw a graveyard that did not know it was a graveyard because buses are not given grief. The bus turned down the service road that ran along that fence, and Arthur hated it for knowing the road so well. The asphalt turned to a patchwork of potholes, and the bus made the decision to find the smoothest path in a series of gentle snakes, history under its tires, the way bones under a hand can direct a doctor to what needs love. The yard opened beyond the fence to a field that in drier months would be dust and scrub. Tonight, it was a mirror of shallow water, broken by long grasses like stitches. He remembered a memo from years back about ground out this way, something about settling and marsh, and why the city never should have built so large on a sponge. He remembered a man in a meeting, a man with a tie folded back over his shoulder to keep it from soup, saying every city has a soft belly. We built a stomach and then put weight on it. It will tell us what it thinks someday. The table had laughed. Arthur had not laughed. He had thought about the bus, about how his job was to move weight around a map, to be the blood in a body in return for a pension that lost its colors as it aged. The bus left the road and took the two ruts that cut down toward the field. He wanted to fight it then. He set his heels. He braced his knees. He knew how to coax or scold the wheel. But the ruts asked to be traveled, and the bus asked to oblige. The frame twisted a little as the right side dipped and the left held pride. The aisle would have swayed if anyone had been there to sway. There was no one in his mirror, and there was everyone in the air. He remembered a time a summer ago when a family of 4 had boarded near the fairgrounds. The littlest had wrapped his hand around the pole and refused to sit because the sensation of moving while standing felt like a privilege. The father had said sit, and Arthur had wanted to lean back and say to every person on that bus, let him stand, let him feel how a machine holds him, let him understand what balance is in time to keep it when the hard corners come. He had said nothing. He had learned to say nothing. He had taught himself to be the kind of man who noticed and did not impose. The ruts sank him toward the mirror field. The bus rose a little then, as if kept afloat by a hand. The wind died, and so did the dim whine from the electrics hidden under the floor. The only sound left was the hiss of the air system and the breath that did not belong to anything he could log. He let his own breaths grow small. He found he could not make them do otherwise. There, in the middle of that shallow water and long grass, the bus slowed to a respectful halt. The dash lights made islands of orange. The windshield took on a skin of fine drops. No true rain, just the perspiration of the night. Arthur set the brake out of sheer addiction to doing what could be done. The bus paid him no mind and did not need to. It sat with a kind of poise he had never seen in a large machine, as if it had joined a line no human eye could see. He listened. He heard the little timer click in the heater. He heard a distant truck change gears on a road that had not been closed to its muscle. He thought he heard frogs and then felt the lie of that. This water was too new and too cold for voices. He heard the breaths behind him collect and arrange, a choir that did not sing, a room full of people bracing to stand, a vigil at a bed where no medicine could be brought. He tried the interior lights. They came up dim. The seats shone with a dampness on their backs that could have been human, except it was not. Just the fabric deciding to acknowledge the air it had been given. The poles gleamed without having been wiped. The floor held his own footprints and the ghost of shoes that were not there, that would never be there, that he felt nonetheless at the ends of his toes like a polite pressure. One by one, he felt the weight change. He did not hear steps. He did not see motion. He felt the back of the bus become less full in a way that reminded him of a room when the crowd clears and the leftover warmth makes you long for the bodies even if you had not liked them. The bus did not rise. The suspension held its opinion. The breath grew thinner, stretched, a cord being drawn across a throat to test the pitch. Then the breath stopped altogether in a way the human body fears most. Arthur did a thing he had not done since he was a kid. He held his breath because something else asked him to. He held until the roar of blood in his ears made a sea that erased the rain. He waited for the exhale that would tell him what he already knew. The world was allowed to treat him as part of its equipment. When it came, the exhale touched his face, not through his nose or mouth, but across the planes of him, as if he were a window someone wiped with the palm of a hand. It was not cold, it was not warm. It had the temperature of intention, the kind that does not have to announce itself in small words. He let his lungs take a small piece of it, because that felt like the right thing to do if a right thing existed. The bus shivered, a tiny toy shake, and the engine clicked alive, not because he turned the key. He would have sworn he had turned it off without memory of the motion, nor because anyone demanded it. The instrument panel found its starlight again. The seat under him hummed with the faintest suggestion of vibration. The bus settled into idle as if it had returned from a long exertion only the chassis could understand. Arthur released the brake because the bus would have done it anyway, and he preferred to grant the courtesy. The wheels rolled backward, a hair on the mire, then caught and pulled forward with a patience he admired. He climbed the ruts out and found the service road again. and did not argue when the bus chose a direction he had never turned on a run and would never be asked to write up for anyone's file. He thought about calling out, as if to a room of late-night passengers, "Last stop." He would have said it with that lightness he could muster when the weather was kind. He would have waited for the few polite nods, the shuffling of bags. He opened his mouth and closed it because the word "stop" had no meaning here. The bus was not on a line that had been laid by the kind of man who prints maps and stands at podiums. As they approached the edge of the private yard, a gap in the fence became a door. No one had cut it. It had never been there before because his eyes would have catalogued it, filed it under oddities to point out to a rookie. The bus slid through without scuffing anything the city might have claimed. He was grateful for that, foolishly. He had always hated leaving a mark where a mark could not be justified. The road beyond was a seam of packed dirt that used to serve trucks when the river rose and needed more respect. It curled under the expressway like a thought you did not want to examine yet. The bus followed, and the concrete above them shed a slow drip in rows. Each impact of water on bodywork, a small percussion that gave the night its rhythm. Far along, a maintenance light burned and made a tunnel of air that allowed rain to pretend it had entered a room. They passed that light. He touched the horn lightly, and it sounded larger in there than it had a right to, as if the underpass had been built to amplify only that note. Beyond the viaduct, the road dissolved into a yard of gravel, knee-deep to a machine. The bus tiptoed across it without kicking up spark or backing itself into a corner. Arthur could feel the shiver through the steering column where the timid stones gave and then hated giving. He apologized in his mind to every piece of the bus that had to work harder at his age. He promised he would not ask it to do this again if he were ever given the option. He offered that oath to the long line of buses he had driven in the city's colors, machines with nicknames and personality like a neighborhood of old men. They reached a gate, and the gate was open and had not been a gate for years. They reached a slope down to a road sunk lower than any man would willingly stand, a road that took stormwater when storms had moods. The bus rolled down the slope with grace. Arthur watched the depth markers painted on the wall to his left, their chipped rules telling drivers of lesser vehicles when not to be proud. He turned his head away to keep from reading the numerals. He could count. He did not want to see the world like that just now. The underpass smelled of old concrete and salt and the breath of a place that has been closed for long spells. The bus's lights made the stains on the walls look like old clothes. At the far end, the city reappeared beyond a frame of arch and darkness. It looked farther away than it should have. It looked like a memory Arthur did not trust. The bus turned into a coil of streets he knew as one knows the back of a hand, scarred and mapped by work. It drove past a laundromat he had always loved because it kept its windows clean and its tile honest, past a funeral home that did not try for class, past an apartment block whose small balconies held chairs that had absorbed many cigarettes. It did not stop. It did not take on or let off. The breaths behind him had resumed their choir, and now here and there, a little harmony threaded them, a patient hum at a corner of the sound he would have suspected was the HVAC if he did not know his bus. He almost let the idea make him laugh because if he did not allow himself that, he would have to pile all his thoughts into an order, and that order would lead him to a room marked understanding where he could not sit. He thought of his ex-wife's last night in the house. How quiet it had been then, the refrigerator clicking, a neighbor's car door, the dryer's drum turning its meaty thud. They had put their coats on and said what they had to say, not much, not nothing. And he had done what he had done since, which was to go on moving, and that had kept his small lights burning. He thought of her hand on the banister, the small pause after the top step before she went back down to the door, and it seemed important to remember the way that banister had felt under his palm the next day, warm still somehow from a person who would not be using it again. The bus set its nose toward the oldest part of the city, where the streets narrowed and the houses leaned toward one another to keep warm in winters that had been meaner than any forecast. It found a street where he never took the bus because of the way cars stacked on both sides, and the soft hump of uneven pavement lifted a machine like his onto a crown from which there was no gentle exit. It did not matter. The cars were gone. The street lay there like a tongue. He could smell bread from a bakery that never kept proper hours, and he could smell river silt ground into mortar a century ago, and he could smell the bus's own age. He saw where the street opened onto a square he had driven around 1,000 times. Tonight, it presented its fountain like a body carried in a parade, plinth and pool slicked by the rain until the stone called glass. The bus circled once, twice. He would have counted and stopped counting at the number that told him something had changed. He did not. He waited for the cue he could not name. On the third circle, if it was the third, the air in the bus thinned a fraction in a way his body knew, and a soft sound whispered in the back where the rear bench wrapped around a corner. Not a voice, not a plea, not a sob, just a change in pressure that made the left side of his jaw ache as if a storm had told his teeth a story. He steadied the wheel. He kept the circle clean. The bus, satisfied with his obedience, slid down a side street that led away from every route of his past and toward the river. The levee path was barred to vehicles and always had been. There was a gate there with paint flaking in the good way. A city seal had once been elegant on it and now was flensed by sun and winter. He had pulled the bus around that gate 100 times in his imagination because he loved imagining defying a rule that had never needed to exist. Tonight, there was no pulling around. The gate stood open like a mouth. The bus climbed the narrow track. The world fell away on one side into reeds and mud, and on the other side into roofs and small lights. He did not look down. He did not look anywhere but dead ahead. They came upon the old flood park where, in soft months, children ran kites hard enough to drag their fathers and mothers a step or two. In spring, those acres turned into a dish of brown water that gleamed under the sun like old glass. Tonight, the field was dark and not wet and not dry, a skin pulled tight and shining at its edges under lamps that seemed to hesitate over their promise. The bus stopped again in a place where no bus had the right to stand. Arthur set the brake and did not know whether he had made the decision or whether the bus had allowed him the illusion. The breaths behind him took on that patient unity again, a slow concert. He felt it as a pressure in the depth of the bus, a kind of center he had never had to think about before. He waited for the doors to open. They did not. He opened them. The rain had gone. The air outside had its own wet, a saturation without drops, a wrapped-in-towel kind of damp. He looked at the steps and saw nothing but steps. He looked at the mirror and saw nothing but seats and poles and the gleam of light where upholstery meets metal. He heard that exhale again, a collective sigh so honest it made him ashamed for all the times he had asked people on this bus to do something loudly, to move, to hurry, to sit. His hand on the wheel felt small as a child, S hand against a father, S back. The bus lowered itself a fraction, a courtesy to the boarding and the disembarking that had become habit long ago on lines where strollers and chairs and bad knees needed their share of the city, S patience. He had once loved that feature, the way the machine bowed without arrogance. Now he felt it settle with the weight of memory rather than weight of feet. He put his head back against the bolster. He shut his eyes. He remembered the way his father had breathed on the couch after dinner, through his nose, a whistle jammed somewhere deep, not from sickness, but from a long relationship with dust and metal. He remembered how, as a boy, he had tried to time his own breathing to that whistle and never could, and how the failure had made him angry then, and how now it made him tender. He did not know how long they stayed at the levee, long enough that his knee began to throb with its old story, long enough for the heater to go from confident to apologetic to comfortable. Long enough for him to think he had made a terrible mistake in ever saying yes to a job where his body could be held still by needs not his own, and then to think he had been saved by it after all. The bus lifted itself a little as if to say, "We can go again." Arthur took his hands from his lap and set them on the wheel like a man accepting a tray. He checked his mirrors, a foolish habit. He signaled to no one and pulled away. The way back into the city was shorter than the way out had been, as that path always is. The bus found streets that had not wanted it earlier and now took it like an apology. It came upon the first real stop sign anyone would recognize, a red octagon that had been painted new this past week, and the bus stopped in deference to it. He smiled because the comedy was not minor. He looked both ways and saw no one and proceeded. At a light near the edges of neighborhoods where people had always said hello to him and always meant it, he set the brake and finally reached again for the mic. He pressed the button down and held it and listened to the wet quiet of the channel. He said his number and his line, and he said, continuing, "We'll return to yard later than scheduled," making an unscheduled deviation due to conditions. He released the button and waited to be scolded or forgiven or asked for particulars. The voice came, "Same woman." The kind man's voices love to love because it does not need them. Copy that, return when safe, call in when stopped. He breathed. He hung the mic and let the bus move when it chose to move. The city had gathered itself while he was gone into a shape that felt thinner and stranger than fatigue could explain. Windows lacked the television flicker that keeps night company. Doors were shut hard as mouths. A dog barked once and stopped as if remembering there was no point in arguing. The wet streets ran with small rivers. The drains drank. The lights along the avenue blinked through their cycle without any cars to instruct. Arthur found, briefly, the old comfort he took in catching a green or forgiving a red, and then lost it because the lights were not for him tonight. The bus experienced them the way a fish experiences the weather, with interest, without obligation. He pulled at last into the narrow road behind the depot. He could see the yard lights through the rain, like beacons set out to convince men they were expected. The bus entered that light and felt itself become a unit again, a plate on a rack, a tool among other tools. Arthur eased onto the bay and set the brake and did not turn the engine off. He sat there in the hum and looked out at nothing with the intensity of someone who must make sure emptiness stays in place. Behind him, the breaths quieted to the level of a fiction you tell your own nerves. A last soft exhale touched the skin of his neck and made the short hairs there fold. He knew he could turn around then if he chose and see the bus as it had been when he began the night. A room with chairs, a floor that could be mopped poles that would carry the fingerprints of people he would never see again. He chose not to. He put a hand on the dash and felt the slight tremble there, the heartbeat of the machine, the remnant of all journeys. He whispered something to it, not words, not even breath, just the shape of a thanks. He shut the bus down. The engine clattered and softened. The cabin went dark in a series of small deaths of light in their housings. He took his thermos and his jacket and his folded route sheet and stepped into the bay air, which carried the sour, sweet smell of hot brakes and gentle wear. The depot had its end-of-night hush. A man somewhere coughed. A woman laughed once with her whole mouth. The coffee on the shelf had turned thick and honorable. He marked his return on the clipboard with a pen that would not cooperate, and shook it and tried again. He signed his name with the care of a schoolboy because he had never lost that habit. He stood at the big window and watched the rain come down off the roof in steady teeth. He knew he would have to say something to someone about why he had been late, why the GPS trace made a shape no supervisor had authorized, why his odometer would disagree with a book. He knew he would not say the words the way they wanted, and that no one would punish him for it. He stood a long time there, until the heat peeled off him like a shirt, and the cold clung to whatever remained. When he finally climbed back into the bus to do the last of his checks, seats flipped lost property, collected fare box tallied lights properly off, he did it with the fussy love he had hidden for decades behind a sarcasm he had never delivered even once. He bent and found a receipt under a seat where no one had sat, a small square of paper that told nothing anyone needed. He placed it in his jacket pocket with the peppermint. He stood at the top of the steps and looked down them into the night. He waited for the nervous impulse that usually came then to turn and check the rear, to make sure a man wasn't lying on the back bench trying to sleep his sorrow off. He did not feel it. He did not turn. He stepped down. Outside, the rain had softened to a patient mist, the kind that almost feels like breath on the back of the neck. He walked across the lot to the door that led into the driver's room, and he knew in the ease of his knees that his route had not ended and would not end where the schedule said it would. He touched the glass of the door, which had been warmed by a heater vent, into a mildness that felt like a person. He pushed through, and the smell of mop water and the old plastic of chairs held him for a moment and let him go. He signed out. He hung his jacket on the peg he always used, though no one would have dared use it if he did not. He rinsed his thermos and set it upside down over the rag, and the drip came off the rim in a steady sequence that made him think of time, not the clock kind, the other kind that buses understand in their bones. He did not try to name it. He did not say to anyone, "I carried them, and they told me where to go," as if that would make him wise. He walked out to the night again and stood under the edge of the roof. The rain stitched from the sky to the asphalt in threads so fine you could pretend the stitches were gentle. Beyond the yard, the city waited with its lights doing what they could. He thought of the empty shelter where he had stopped against every lesson, and he felt the old impulse to drive back there to see what the ground told him now. He would not. He would sleep first. He would come back the next night, and the next, and the next, as long as someone gave him keys and as long as the bus took him where the new passengers desired. He had never had such a simple plan. In his small apartment above a shop that sold nothing you needed in the day and everything in the night, he stood with his hands on the sink and felt the building breathe in tiny ways. The pipes, the floorboards, the quiet that is never pure quiet in a city whose body has more than one heart. He washed his face and patted it dry with a towel that had lost its fight years ago. He put the peppermint in a saucer on the counter and stood looking at it as if it might announce something. He moved to the window and looked out across the street to the awning of the bakery, and the light left on in the back, where proofing happened at hours he could not name. He watched the reflection of the streetlight drift across the wet pavement, a long, slow swimmer. He lay down and put his hand on his chest, as if to keep himself from lifting off while he slept. He thought of the sigh from the back of the bus, the way the unseen had told him in good faith that they were there and would behave themselves, and also that the bus belonged to them now in a patient way that honored his years at the wheel. He slept as you sleep, when you have driven a machine through a long rain and have been permitted to return it to its stall. He woke before the alarm he had not set, at a time in the night that can break men who are not used to being summoned by muscles. He listened to the building and to the city and to the part of him that had become a seat upholstery with a man poured into it. He could not hear those breaths in his apartment. He could only hear his own. He found that a mercy, and he found it a loss. He kept his hand on his chest until the beating there told him another story, one about a job a man takes because it makes the days more obedient. When he closed his eyes again, he saw the ruts in the field and the way the bus had floated a little as it crossed the mirror water, and he felt a preposterous pride, as if he had chosen the route or designed the machine or drawn the map. He let himself have that for a breath. He let it go, and the letting go felt like putting the bus into gear and releasing the brake toward a stop no one had named out loud, one that waited outside the city limits, at the edge of the floodplain, a shelter where glass held old fingerprints, a place you could pass and one night feel the instruction come up through your boots and know that you were done passing anything by. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.